Well, comrades, you're all welcome to this meeting of Workers' International Network. My name is Finn Geeney. I'll be chairing the meeting. We're very privileged to have tonight as our speaker, Rabab Al-Nayem, who's an activist in Sudan and the Sudanese Workers' Alliance for the Restoration of Trade Unions. And there's a strong trade union tradition in Sudan, which no doubt we'll hear about in Rabab's contribution. Rabab is also a women's activist, a co-founder of Buta, a podcast which deals with women's issues, along with capitalism and colonialism. The most immediate problem, of course, is the coup of October 24th, which Rabab will speak about, and the thousands of people protesting on the streets, the shootings, plus the rubber bullets and the rest that are used. And the demand is for the restoration of civilian rule, which was meant to come about anyway from a transition. There's a deep economic crisis, which we hear about in Sudan, record inflation, shortages of goods, poverty. And in all of that, women are playing a key role in all of the demonstrations, in all of the organizations, in all of the activities. Now, Sudan has had a very turbulent history ever since its independence from Britain in 1956. The army has always played a very big role in Sudanese politics, starting with the coup 2 years after independence, civil war, and so on. And then a major coup in 1989, where the al-Bashir regime took over, along with the National Islamic Front. They were overthrown after a huge mass protest after 20 years of rule. Mass protests, and that regime fell. And the transitional regime which replaced it was meant to lead the civilian rule. But before that came about, there was the army coup of 3 weeks ago. So we look forward to hearing from Rabab a detailed account of events and analysis and a bit of background to the situation as it's developing in that country. Now, Rabab, how long do you think you would need for your opening contribution?
Planning around 20 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. So I'll remind you in about 20 minutes. Then.
Awesome, thank
you.
Rabab,
you can start your opening contribution now.
Okay, thank you. I want to start by glory to the martyrs of Sudan and long live the struggle of the people of Sudan. I want to thank everyone for their time, for their solidarity, and I look forward to exchanging lessons that can further the struggle of the working class worldwide. Like Finn mentioned, since the independence of Sudan, the military has always played a role in the politics. But I always like to speak from the side of the working class. I want to start by first giving a background of how the organized labor movement in Sudan has also played a major role in politics in Sudan and the intersection between labor movement organization and politics. We see early signs of labor union organization. Maybe the earliest sign we can attest is 1908. During the British Egyptian colony, we've seen workers of forestry unionize and plan a strike, demanding for better work conditions. And this movement of sort of an organic way of organizing and seeing the liberation of the Sudanese people, along with the liberation of the working class of Sudan, has developed till 1947, when we've seen the Sudan Railways Worker Association create their association. And this is key, not just to understand how early the working class of Sudan has organized and in unions or in different associations, but to see that we have done this without the recognition of the state, regardless if the state is a colonial authority like the British Egyptian authority, or even a national authority. So in 1947, we've seen Rail Worker Association, and then the year after, the British had to actually issue the first labor-related law, and then maybe like an amendment for how to register and how to recognize unions. And this movement continued until 1950, where we've seen the Sudanese Worker Trade Union Federation, and we've seen in 1953 a sit-in from agriculture workers and farmers from Al Jazeera, which is a big agricultural project in Sudan. They practiced the first sit-in. So I mentioned this to mention the history of the Sudanese working class in organizing, in mobilizing and organizing, and how this has always been independent, democratic, and we actually practice freedom of association. And this, I think, would be one of the biggest lessons we've learned from the first wave of the December 2018 revolution and this second wave we live at. So it makes sense living in a post-colonial situation in Sudan. It makes sense that labor movement is the target, the same way it was a target for the British colony. It's also a target of whatever government we see after. Sudan gained independence in 1956, and 2 years after gaining independence, we actually had the first military coup. And this has to do with the way the military structure is. So we live in a post-colonial state with the military that is very much still with the same structure of the colonial era. So, and the 1958, the first coup, the 1958, it had a lot to do also. I was in November, actually, we like this Wednesday is the anniversary of that coup. But it had a lot to do with farmer, again, organizing, agriculture worker organizing. And there was a big also sit-in where we lost almost more than 50 farmers who actually lost their life for suffocation. They were actually locked by the government and they suffocated and they died as a result of that process. So we always see, it seems like we always see some sort of a transitional couple of years of assumed democracy, and then we see some sort of a labor movement really strong, and then we see some sort of a violence that either end with more compromise with the military or the military taking over. And this pattern, we can see it in the 1958 coup, we can see it in the 1969 coup, and we can see it also in the revolution of 1964, also had a lot to do with workers and professional organizing, also in 1958, and then recently in 2019 with the Sudanese Professional Association. So I think the key to understand and to move forward is to understand this chain of events, to understand how the same policy, regardless of who's the player, if it's a military or if it's a civilian, we seems to be within like a vicious cycle of some labor movement organizing and calling for their rights, and then someone cracking down on them. So the event, the coup in 1989 that brought al-Bashir to power, along with the Islamic Brotherhood, that coup in itself was not a surprise, because the policies, the economical policies that have been followed in Sudan since the 1970s, since the interference of the IMF, had not really changed. We've seen economical policy where the state drives away from the wealth of the people and then give the people nothing in advance. We've seen the same elite growing their money, growing their pockets, where people who actually responsible for production and making of wealth, gaining nothing out of that. So the event leading to the 2019, it was a long chain of events. Like I said, we started seeing maybe the oil discovery in Sudan in the 90s, in the early 2000s, gave the Bashir regime some sort of a room to move around. But with the separation of South Sudan, that room kind of came to a halt, and we've seen really harsh economical measures. We've seen a wave of protest in 2013, we've seen a wave of protest in 2015, and we've seen a wave in 2017. Leading up to the Sudanese Professional Association creation. So I cannot say a particular date where like the Sudanese Professional Association was established, but it was basically established with different professional, different unionization associations that are trying to fight the regime unionization. Because like I said, we can trace this back even to the very first coup. Almost always, the first decision of the coup is to dissolve unions, because they know that this is the power that usually used to mobilize and then organize and maybe achieve actually whatever the revolution goals are. So we've seen that dissolve of unions in 1958, and we've seen it in 1969, and again, we've seen it in 1989. But what was different with the Bashir rule is after the dissolve of the unions, started creating this idea of a union per workplace, which is basically in the same workplace, regardless of what type of work, administrative work or physical work you do. So like the boss and the worker are within the same union. And obviously this is a scam because there is a very obvious conflict of interest. If I am the worker, then I'm trying to fight for my rights from the boss or from whoever is taking the big share of profit. So we cannot be in the same body and expect that body to actually come with benefit from my side, from my inside as a worker. Like I said, I cannot really trace back the start of the Sudanese Professional Association, but we have seen them publish a study regarding the minimum wage and a living wage in maybe August 2018. And they actually called at that point for a campaign. The purpose of that campaign was to improve the minimum wage and to talk about what is a livable wage in Sudan. But as the protest started in early December, some of the early protests in the December revolution is traced back to December 6th in a small village called near Sinnar in Sudan, which is of the capital. So the Sudanese Professional Association found themselves in the situation of having to lead and change the calls from just the minimum wage, upping their demand to the removal of the entire regime. And it started with the same old political player, the same parties, political parties, with the Sudanese Professional Association, and hence we had the creation of the Freedom and Change Forces Declaration, January 1st, 2019. And the movement started to find, because, and also as a result of all of these different 30 years of the dictatorship, and this never really lived democracy in Sudan, and maybe to a large extent also has to do with the global south, generally speaking, we've seen a lot of depoliticized movement, a lot of movement from youth and women steering away from traditional political parties, under the pretense that political parties don't really speak to the needs of the Sudanese people, and they've always been basically in the same bed with a regime. So we've seen people moving away from politics and going into, for example, charity work, trying to kind of replace the state. We've seen a lot of initiative of young people of Sudan skipping away from politics and trying to replace the state. So all of these circumstances kind of put the Sudanese Professional Association into the leader of the movement in 2019, or the first wave of the revolution, without necessarily having the right structure to actually lead the revolution to its goal, without even having independency from the FFC, Freedom and Change forces. So with that, we had the first wave of revolution, and it continued from early December 2018 all the way leading up to the sit-in in April 6, 2019, and we had a sit-in in front of the headquarters of the military in the capital Khartoum. With that, it almost reached the same, if we're thinking of that pattern, it reached a high point of where some interest, whether if it's a national, regional, or international interest, need to break the cycle of the people mobilizing. I would say until that point, it was mainly people mobilizing with the leadership of the Sudanese Professional Association. And then even that Sudanese Professional Association started calling for more decentralized mobilization. And hence we've seen the rise of the neighborhood resistance committee all over Sudan. So we've reached a height of the mobilization maybe in April 10, April 9, after multiple attempts of cracking down and after small rank soldiers actually protected the sit-in against order from the military. So we've seen the height, and then we had again the Ministry of Defense, and this is how it usually goes. There is usually a prime minister or a president of some sort, and then there is some sort of a popular uprising, and then the Ministry of Defense will step in and be like, it's a coup, this is, we take over the power, we're gonna give you 1 or 2 years of transitional, and then the same previous political power come back into play. So when we first had Ibn Auf, which was it was I think April 11, and this in my mind, like the way I say it, we have been living in a coup since April 11, 2019, not just from October 25th of 2021. We've been living in a coup since April 11, when the Ministry of Defense actually stepped in and they announced in their statement that to protect the country and all of that jazz, they're going to take over. But the political awareness of the Sudanese people, especially the wide and the decentralized movement from December 2018 leading to April 2019, kind of saw this this kind of a scam the way it is, and there was multiple chanting basically saying that nothing has happened, it did not fall yet, there is no difference between al-Bashir and the Ministry of Defense of al-Bashir. So within like 12 hours or so, Ibn Auf, the Ministry of Defense for al-Bashir, actually stepped down, and then we've seen al-Burhan. With all of that, the FFC is supposed to be in talks to take over power. It was not supposed to be a negotiation. So the changing from actually taking over power into negotiation happened sometime after April 11. And this is the beginning of the coup, because no one knew who the Burhan was, or even Hemeti, in the sense that they had no stakehold into the revolution and the development of the revolution up to April 2019. But somehow the same interest, nationally, regionally, and internationally, came together and changed the route from just talking about taking over the power into negotiating how power is going to be shared between civilian and military, without really talking about what is the interest difference between military and civilian, if there is any. I would argue that there is really no difference, and they basically serve the same interest. And this has to do to a large fact that one of the biggest 3 or 4 political parties that are still or were still part of FFC until the October 25th coup were actually trying to get into election of 2020. So it seems like the 2019, the first wave of revolution, kind of cut off the compromise of election in 2020. So in reality, those political parties or those economical interests were very comfortable within al-Bashir regime, to the point that they were thinking that we can actually change, or we can actually have a better situation just within a freely democratic election. And this speaks to the fact that there is really no substance difference between both. But throughout April 2019, we've seen the political mood increase. We've seen, and this has to do with the fact that it was a whole social experience. It wasn't just, you were not protesting for part of the day and being just active in building barricades and defending yourself and your comrades, but you were actually actively living in a society that breathes and sleeps the freedom, peace, and justice, the 3 slogans of the Sudanese revolution. The setting was almost like the dream of Sudan that we wanted. The dream of Sudan were free education. There was like free classroom set up. There was like free medical care. It was an environment where we actually lived freedom, peace, and justice. So as the protest went in and the city went in, and although the FFC was getting deep in with the military council in their so-called negotiation, the revolutionary powers actually became more radical, and Burhan dissolving unions in April 22nd of 2019. So again, that same cycle of some sort of Ministry of Defense trying to step in. The first target is always union and labor movement, but there was a different player, a key player in that, and that key player was Resistance Neighborhood Committee. We've seen a big strike for 2 days during the negotiations between FFC and the military council. That was May 28, May 29, and some analysis will go as far as say that the strength of that strike and the fact that the TMC, the Transitional Military Council, saw that the revolutionary powers are actually getting more organized than just mobilized, because there is a difference between just practicing in a protest into actually developing that mobilization into a sit-in where it's family friendly, where you can have hours and hours of discussion about how you would like Sudan to be ruled. How do you see, what is your version of freedom, peace, and justice within your economical, your social structure? How do you see that? And taking that step further to a full strike for 2 days all over the country. And the sitting was not just in Khartoum, it was in many different cities across Sudan. So I would say that the violence that we've seen in June 3rd, to a large extent, it was also a result of the people organizing better. Even within the June 3rd, and after the shut off of internet until June 30th, and the Million March in June 30th, where it happened absolutely without internet connection. It was just the will of the people organizing and mobilizing to again reject the military partnership. But again, the FFC, the best way I can put it, without digging deep into intention and history and reading the patterns of those political parties and the way they carry their business, is they simply fail to see democracy as popular democracy. They fail to see the thousands in the street organizing and mobilizing to be expressing their democracy, and they still see democracy behind closed door within the same elite. The reality of it is obviously is not that simple. It's not a romantic way of saying, oh, they just misjudge. I would say that it was actually quite to their best interest because they needed, in game theory, for example, you need a beta male for you to be an alpha male. So they needed the bad guy for them to look like the good guy. And the bad guy in that sense would be the transitional military council. And they're supposed to be the good guy. But the partnership in itself, it started very weak and it continued to be very weak. So to a large extent, the coup or like the second wave of the coup, if you want to say that, in October 25th was not a surprise. It was, there was no escaping it. We actually knew that this was going to happen. We just did not know the exact circumstance of it happening. And between August 17, 2019, where the political charter for the partnership between FFC and the military council was signed, until the October 21st, where we've seen one of the biggest movement, we've seen the revolutionary. You cannot go for 1 month without seeing a strike somewhere in Sudan from some labor movement organization or from resistance committee. And every June 3rd, every Ramadan 29th, we see people calling for justice regarding the martyrs of Sudan. So with that, again, when you see, it's almost like the October 25th was again a result of the popular revolutionary advancing and building better methods, better networks among themselves. And then we've seen the October 25th. And again, obviously, after October 25th, 2021, we've seen again a rule for, or a direction for dissolution of trade unions. But the thing is, we have learned a lot of lessons in the last 2 years. And one of the biggest lessons that I'm very, very proud of as a Sudanese is trade unions and worker association don't gain their legitimacy from the state. It actually get their power from the General Assembly. So, and we've seen workers in state-run companies for oil production actually coming out and saying that regardless of the decision to dissolve unions or not, we have been elected by our General Assembly and we shall carry our work, our struggle for the best interest of the workers in this specific field. And we've seen it also across different fields among professors in University of Khartoum, among professors in University of Niala, and among different workers. So this is one of the biggest lesson that we came out with. But we need to think of what, in order for this work to advance, in order for the second wave of the revolution, we actually need to think about what is at stake. October 25th, 2021, the same way it's a crisis, it's an opportunity because it took us back to April 2019. And it took us back to April 2019 with a little bit more of lessons in organizing, not just mobilizing, but at the same time, the regional, national, and international stakeholders are very much involved. Before the coup, the 25th of October coup, with a couple of days, we've seen both Burhan and Hemeti coming out with a statement in support of democratic transformation and going from one state in the country to a different state in the country. We see the FFC until as recent as yesterday, even after the brutal crackdown on November 13 Million March, we've seen them still talking about going back to what's before October 25th. So the bar is very low for the same old political players, right? Because like I said, the partnership with the military is actually their best winning card. They know because they lack the shared interest with the General Assemblies of Unions, General Assembly of Neighborhood Resistance Committee, and they see them as part of the issue. So there is different players in Sudan right now. The street is coming up with a slogan of 3 no's, no compromise, no negotiation, no partnership. FFC is still trying to take us back to effectively October 24th of 2021. And the transitional military is, at this point, it seems like it's lost, but it's not at the same time. It's lost because we understand that no coup will ever happen without actually having supporters nationally, regionally, and internationally. And we know the key players in this, right? We still see the players that even refuse to call this a coup the way it is. But what I think they did not have in mind is how evolved the Sudanese people are in terms of like organizing at this point. So they did not really count for that. So it seemed like the traditional or like the military is in a weak spot because it's lacking recognition, but it's not lacking recognition all the way because there's a lot of players: Israel, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the US, and many other international players. But the way I see it, if the military, if things end up going back to the October 24th, it's not a lose situation for the military because they were effectively ruling the country, right? So it's not really a lose-lose situation for the military. At this point, what is needed to be done, I would say that although we've learned a lot in the last 2 years, but we're still lacking. I would not say that we fully moved from mobilization to organization, just because although Neighborhood Resistance Committee is able to, so the structure would be in a city, within a state, there is different neighborhoods, there is committee that will build up to, you can say an alliances or like a network of resistance committee within the city and then within the state. But we're still not able to translate whatever mobilization into a political act. This is from the side of resistance committee. At the same time, yesterday and the day before yesterday, we first started seeing maybe an alliance of different trade unions, which is also tricky because some of these trade unions don't necessarily express the interest of its General Assembly. So I would say we have a lot to learn, but the revolution continues. I think I'll stop here and see how the discussion goes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nawal, for a very enlightening, a very interesting contribution. The first thing that strikes me listening is the bravery and commitment and resilience of the workers in Sudan, again and again and again. Not just day by day or year by year, but decade after decade, fighting and resisting the army and the record in that country. So there's a lot to discuss there. Also the trade unions as they organize in a country of that nature, particularly the professional trade unions and the major role that they have played. And then there's the interesting lessons about the force of freedom and change, where the political parties form an alliance with the Transitional Military Council. There's lots of lessons there as to whom you can trust and what the parties actually stand for ultimately. So there's lots of material for discussion there, comrades. Now, anybody who wants to speak can indicate on the participants with list with the electronic hand. And I have 2 hands already. After a certain point, Nabab, you can come in and answer some of the questions, and then we'll let the discussion develop a bit further and you can come back again a second time, but we'll see how the discussion goes. But for the moment, we'll ask people to make their own contributions and ask questions, and then I'll bring you in then, Nabab, at a later point to answer some of these points. I think Peter was the first one I saw, followed by Steve Zelser and then David Hampson.
Thank you, Rabab. Can I just ask, there's dissent from all 4 corners of the planet with regard to al-Burhan's decision to call a military coup. It strikes me that the USA, even the UK, the EU, and the United Nations are about to put sanctions upon them. What I really need to know is, will that help? And is it helping now? Have they got any influence at the moment? And will al-Burhan listen? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Steve, you're next.
Sorry I got on late, but I did want to ask Rabab about the role of U.S. Imperialism and also the fishing, the destruction of the fishing industry in Sudan. In the United States, they say that Sudan is a failed state. That's what their justification is for intervention. But what is the history of that U.S. imperialism and the resources, how the resources have been taken over by the imperialists? And also, has there been any role of the AFL-CIO in the unions in Sudan, the U.S. labor imperialism? Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. David Hampson.
Well, first of all, I must say it was a marvelous presentation, and we're so happy to have you discussing with us as the struggle continues there in Sudan. And if I could say, the general view from afar is that the struggle could be suppressed. In Africa, where we see there are coups, they're extremely difficult to get rid of. Men with guns are prepared to open up with machine guns against the people. It just, the arithmetic of struggle seems absolutely desperate. And yet it's continued and continued and continued. And the resilience that you've spelt out indicates the strength of the working class, despite its fragmentation and and lack of formal or extended industrialization, as I imagine. But still, the idea of organization is electric, and it's actually mobilized, thousands and time again in struggle, against the regime, which is quite implacable. And it raises a question which we've been debating, is it possible actually to have democratic regimes, in colonial countries? I mean, everywhere we've seen in Africa that the state is degraded. It's the men with guns are the closest, to political authority. And even in South Africa, which has had a huge democratic transition and struggle, over decades, we've seen open massacres of workers, unbelievable. And on top of it, the state has actually, the state president of the time has got away with this, despite the fact that we have unions. So in other words, we see violence against the working class is, what we see in Africa, and it's extremely difficult. It's a celebration from our side, I think, and from South Africa, to see workers in the front line, and not just youth. Like in South Africa, we've had the school youth and others who have taken the front line. We see here from the pictures, absolutely, it's not just some women, it's actually whole phalanxes of women in marching, which is a huge the strength of the movement as democratic composition. And it seems that as you've spelt out, there was a compromise. The idea of two stages, that you could, first of all, have a democratic struggle, then you'd have a transition, which would go on, and then somewhere along the line, you'd have an election. And that's exactly what's not happened. Throughout Stalinist theory is that there will be two stages, that you'll go from initially a weak form of democracy to a deepened democracy, and then you'd be able to advance to socialism. And it's never happened. It's always a counter-revolution. All the workers have to take the revolutionary position and overthrow the state. There's no halfway measure, it seems, and that's part of the general theory, of the permanent revolution. We've seen in Sudan, workers in the, taking the advanced position, mobilizing. At the same time, we've seen that in the region, when the workers move, then the different despotic regimes in the area, mobilize to give strength to the utmost repression from the state. And I just want to raise then the question of, of Egypt. I mean, at one time, Egypt and Sudan were one entity as a colonial entity. That changed with independence, but it's obvious that, the regime in Egypt is very averse to any democratic transition in Sudan, which would threaten its base because it's a dictatorship, a most ferocious dictatorship with United States support. So any indication from Biden and elsewhere that they support democracy in Sudan seems an absolute travesty. And yet there is some verbal, as mentioned with the sanctions, that there could be something of that kind. So it's a very dangerous position because obviously the existing political parties want to push that idea that if only we stay on good terms with the United States, somewhere along the line, America will put, elbow the military out and give us a chance. In fact, it's another question I'd like to raise with you. The relationship with Israel and the United States is forced, initially it was Trump forcing the transitional government to be able to give recognition to Israel as a quid pro quo, as the basic basis before any aid, any assistance could be given to the people. And so you've had this, economic crisis continuing and the social crisis as well, because, US imperialism, IMF, the World Bank is not prepared to provide the resources to be able to allow a certain stabilization. And that's allowed the military to say that, democracy is leading to chaos and we have to, reestablish order. So there's it's not that it's all determined in my view. I mean, I'd like to debate. It's not as though it's all set in concrete, But these are the way in which the dynamics of the situation work, that, the economic crisis, has to be resolved one way or the other to be able to keep the momentum of mobilization and so forth. Well, look, let me just stop there. I didn't want to say too much, except that, we've now seen, we're seeing a kind of powerful array of reaction. Reaction now and also includes China, Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine such bed partners, and others, and possibly even now Ethiopia, because it's into chaos, because it wants any order that it can have in the region. And so it's, the working class appears to be on its own. And that's why, our discussion is so important, to see in what way we can actually provide, support and help and assistance. Just one last point. When I was in prison in Zimbabwe, we used to listen to the radio every night, BBC on, that's all we had, Africa, program. And the situation there in Sudan, there was great hopes that the Communist Party and so forth in the early 1980s would have mobilized and helped bring about a change. In fact, just another question, what has been the role of the Communist Party? Obviously, it's had some role, and yet the, through its alliance with different regimes of dictatorship, it seems to have had a very, very treacherous role. But again, thanks for your contribution.
Thank you, David. I'll take two further speakers, and then we'll ask Nabab to come back and answer some of the points. So we'll have Leslie first, then John Ryman, and then Rabab to answer some of the points. So, Leslie.
Thanks, and thank you very much for your contribution, Rabab. If my sound goes poor, I'll switch off the video. Yeah, our last International Women's Day demonstration in early March 2019, there was a fantastic section of Sudanese women who charged down to the front and were full of enthusiasm and fighting spirit, and that was just a tiny taste really of what we've seen over those struggles. So a question really about what is the role of women in the trade unions and the workplace in terms of the strength, and also in the general assemblies? Is there a tradition of women, in organised workplaces? Just be interested to hear more about that. I agree with David's point about, that this amongst other countries really shows a permanent revolution, that, democratic national regimes have been totally undelivered by very weak ruling classes who rely either totally on the military or totally on domination by United States or other imperialist powers. But the other question I wanted to ask was just really how the General Assemblies, Rabab, were constituted, and what the role of your organisation, SWATU, the strength of SWATU in the General Assemblies, and what role that your organisation's been able to play in there. And the very last point, just to echo what Dave has said, about how we can assist with any solidarity, because obviously you're in a very difficult position at the moment. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. So, John Ryman.
So I have a couple of questions. First, Rabab, you had mentioned something about that young people are moving away from politics, and how did you put it? I think seeking to replace the state or something like that. And I'm just curious what form that takes. In the United States, we have something, some young people say that they're creating dual power, in quotes, by providing food for the hungry and stuff like that. And of course, it's a complete illusion. It's a little different from what different churches and so on do. And so I would relate that to a related question I have is, Rabab, you had mentioned about unions that have the bosses in them are a scam. And of course, we have the same issue as far as political parties. And so I'm wondering about the perspectives for a working class political party in Sudan, but maybe the situation has gone beyond that at the present point, and there's a potential to jump directly to actually a situation of real dual power, where the forces of the movement can start to actually rival the state, the repressive forces of the state, and start to push that out of power. That's my first question. Then the other one, Rabab, you had mentioned something about democracy behind closed doors within the same elite. And I wasn't quite sure if you were talking about Sudan or the United States, because that sounds like a perfect description of what we have here. And in that, and I don't think that the United States and Sudan are the extreme exceptions on that either. And so with that in mind, and also what you said about hours and hours and hours of discussion. And so I think that the whole history, if you go back all the way back to the 1979 revolution in Iran, to the Arab Spring, so on, and including in Syria, to what's happening in Iraq today, that I think what's been proven is that capitalism, David talked about democracy, but it's capitalism that cannot provide any form of stable democracy. And so my other question is, and I agree with what David said about and others about the idea of the permanent revolution and so on. And I'm wondering, in those discussions, Rabab, that you talked about, is there a discussion about socialism and how to link up the struggle against oppression and against the military dictatorship and so on with the struggle to get rid of the so-called elite or the rule of the capitalist class altogether?
Thanks, John. We'll now give an opportunity to Rabab to deal with some of the points that the speakers have raised up to now. So Rabab.
Okay, so I tried my best to capture all the questions. I think to address some of them, I will have to go between one question to the other because they are linked. The struggle is the same. Okay, so I want to start by someone asked if calling it a coup will actually help. It will help to the extent, I want to make this very clear that the way the Sudanese people, the way we see it, the way Sudanese people need solidarity is from allies all around to hold their government, to hold their economical interest accountable. So calling it a military coup, the way it is, not to express concern about Sudan or to fight a fight for Sudanese people, but actually to fight where you actually live and to hold whatever government or whatever financial interest you have accountable. For example, there is a lot of public relation companies in Canada that helps the Rabbit forces, which is part of the forces that actually, it's a state-led militia that played a big part in the violence in June 3rd, 2019, and violence that we see every day today. This same militia is largely funded by something called Khartoum process, which was carried by the European Union to maybe counterattack illegal migration from Africa to Europe. So calling it a coup, what we ask from and I think this question came a lot, is how can all of you can help? All of you can help by holding your government accountable, by actually making sure that your government does not interfere in Sudan. And by making sure that whatever tax money you pay is actually not funding the deaths of Sudanese people and the creation of the failed state of Sudan, because it is a creation and it's a neoliberal creation, but I will come to that. Someone also asked about the role of the US. historically in Sudan, and the role of the, I'm not sure if I got this right, the imperial labor movement in Sudan, in the US. I would say that this is not at least the labor union or the labor movement in the US is not very clear in Sudan, but this has to do with the fact that to a large extent, the Sudanese labor movement started actually with the formation of, or it led to the formation of the Sudanese Communist Party, which was very much against, still is against the US. So there is really no exchange of relations between labor unions in Sudan, historically speaking, and the US. But from a government point of view, even the very first coup in 1958, there was the question of US aid to Sudan and how the US is going to help feed the hunger of Sudan. So the US has always played a role, and in so many different ways, not just, it doesn't have to be a military interference, but definitely a softer type of interference. Even talks with the previous Bashir regime leading to the election of 2020 that never happened because the revolution actually cut off the way of that compromise. So there's always a rule of the US. It's basically whatever you see in the US, you're on the other way. Someone also asked about the peaceful protests and if we can have democracy within a colonial setting or a post-colonial setting. And the fact that we always see counter-revolution in Africa, generally speaking, or in the global South. And yes, but this is mainly has to do with the question, I think, like Gramsci put it, right? It's the optimism of the will. We, like I said earlier, we have learned in the last 2 years is that us as ordinary revolutionary people of Sudan, the working people of Sudan, should not be replaced by the elite, because the elite doesn't have the same interest as we do. Keeping the movement peaceful actually allow, it does not only fight against the economy of war. The economy of war can never be for the best interest of people, regardless if it's a civil war within the same country or between different countries, because what loses actually out of this war is the working class of the both countries. So this is one way of looking at why we stick with peaceful movement, peaceful protest. But the other way to look at it is when it's a peaceful protest, you actually allow the to actually partake in it. So you give people the power back. And the whole idea is to allow the stakeholder, the people who have the actual interest in peace, freedom, and justice to advance to leadership and to advance to translated political stand. So in a post-colonial setting, and we understand that it's a struggle, but even the way we define democracy, or we define the three slogans of our revolution, or the way we should start thinking more about it is it's a liberation. A celebration from Sudanese capitalism, it's a celebration from international capitalism. So you cannot have, like, for example, if we take the first slogan, peace is a result. You're not going to have peace unless you have equity, unless you have sustainable development all over Sudan, right? Because these are the reasons for war. So to get to peace, you actually have to go through the redistribution of power and wealth among the people of Sudan. And this takes me to, like I said, I'm sorry, I'm going to be jumping from one to the other. As someone said, it's not democracy, it's capitalism that is not able to provide democracy. And if we had such discussions in the Syrian, in Sudan, in Khartoum, and around different cities in Sudan, and the answer is absolutely yes. The left has never been stronger in Sudan than it has been in the last 2 years. I would argue that the left has always been progressive in Sudan compared to, like, at least some regions in some countries in the region. And it has to do with the idea that the whole identity of us being Arab versus African, it played a little bit because most of the left in Egypt, for example, in Syria, it was linked to Arab identity, which weakened the idea of being a communist or a socialist even, right? But in Sudan, we did not see that. And we also seen that the Sudanese Communist Party dived away from that. And this is a good segue into the role of the Sudanese Communist Party. I would say it played an important role, but at the same time, its limit kind of stopped the role, and this is actually to the best interest of the revolution. The slogan of freedom, peace, and justice was actually the slogan of the Sudanese Communist Party General Conference in 2017. And the main journal that speak for the party has many articles published in 2017, 2018, calling for the resistance, neighborhood resistance committee to form and to take place even at the workplace. So they were asking for the Sudanese people to form resistance committee in the workplace and also in their neighborhood. And like I said earlier, the way I track the fairest wave of protest in 2018 was somewhere around Sinnar in December 6, 2018. And 2 days before that, the Communist Party of Sinnar actually called the people to take to the street under the leadership of the Resistance Neighborhood Committee. And throughout until maybe June 30th, we've seen the Communist Party get more power in the streets, just because the type of statement they were putting, they were against negotiation, but there was a lot of hesitance and a lot of struggle within the party itself, to the point that negotiation actually won, or like whatever part of the party that was for negotiation, if you're gonna call it PT bourgeoisie, whatever, actually won, but they came against and they critiqued themselves, and they actually left the FFC maybe mid 2020. But anyway, I would say that this is for the best interest of the revolution, is because the Sudanese Communist Party itself need a lot of work within itself for it to be qualified to lead. So since you're not qualified to lead, it's best to step aside, figure out your internal issues, and then you can take the step back. But generally speaking, I would say that the left, as in a popular movement in Sudan, has never been stronger than in the last 2 years or so. Okay. Someone also mentioned, sorry?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Someone also mentioned something about the economical situation and how it needs to be a little better for the mobilization to continue. I would say that this has to do back with defining what is that democratic transformation that we're all trying to get to. And I would say the mobilization is not the goal in itself, right? It's just a tool. We would like to see organization, and the economical situation is never going to improve in Sudan unless we build different type of organizations, until we organize labor in a way that work for the interest of the workers. And this has to do with the structure of the state in general as a colonial power, regardless of who's in charge. If it's Hamdok is in charge, the state's still a colonial power, because this state will take the wealth created for the people and not distribute it to the people. So we need the people to be at the driving force, to take lead in building their own institutions that will help for the economical situation. The idea of somehow the economical situation is going to improve without the direct interference and the direct leadership of the working class. This idea is never for the best interest of the working class. Sure, the GPD might be better. We might be stricken out from the country's terrorist state, wherever that the US had that list, and we might get loans from the IMF or whatever, but it's not for the day-to-day people of Sudan. It's for the elite of Sudan. So for the economical situation to actually improve, we need to allow, or for the Sudanese working class to take charge, not allow it, but actually support it to take charge of its own destiny in building institutions. And when I say institution, I'm talking about the very, from the smallest institution of daycare in a neighborhood, all the way to the Ministry of Education. people interested to be represented in all of that. I think I touched a little bit on the role of the Sudanese Communist Party. And okay, so women role in work places and unionization. I think I would like to rephrase the question, because I think the way this question is usually asked also entails some sort of a new liberal or some sort of an identity politics in it, that they see women not as part of the working class, but as an identity similar to the working class, or a competing identity to the similar class. Historically speaking, women in Sudan has gained political and economical powers early 1960s. We have women elected to the parliament. We've gained the right for equal pay for equal work and so on. But within the last 30 years, like I said, the entire working class unionizing effort has decreased significantly as a result of the Bashir movement. But there is a lot of work to be done regarding women and unionization. And this does not really need to stay away from identity politics and asking the question. I think the question needs to be rethought of, even the question of the role of women in unionization. But there is a lot of labor-related issues that mainly affect women in a different way. For example, the type of hours that you get. For example, we see a lot of women get less hours, which means they have less chance of advancing in the workplace, and thus far, and also the workplace not being friendly enough to the Sudanese community standards, and hence women find themselves in a tougher situation to actually advance in the workplace. And also, I have a question, how SWARTO plays a role. So SWARTO is an umbrella of different individuals and different worker organizations. So our goal is to restore the tradition of the Sudanese working class and to build on that. And that tradition, in the way we see it, is basically unions and worker organization is built on the power of General Assembly. And no one should really tell or decide a certain way of unionization. You can unionize the same way your General Assembly allows you to do that. So what we do is we try to link different organizations, different labor union organizations, and create networks among them based on mutual issues. And we've seen this a lot in, for example, in the IT sector and the oil sector. There is a lot of companies that source out workers. So they kind of play the middleman between the boss and between the workers. And as a result of that, workers work under conditions that, like I said, especially women, they get less hours, which means they get less benefits, which means they have less chance of actually advancing. But there is a lot of them because there's a lot of women in the IT sector, at least in Sudan. So this is one role that we played. And we also work a lot with safety. And we have multiple injuries and multiple incidents because of the lack of safety in the workplace. We also work to help people with their General Assembly, either by help drafting different laws for the different unions, or even providing consultancy as they navigate the process of building or electing their union. I also have questions about unions where the boss and the worker, and if there is a direction for a working class party. The funny thing is the Communist Party is supposed to be the working class party. And I say this with a lot of sadness, just because the first official union or worker association, the Sudanese Railway Worker Association, was part of a communist anti-imperial movement that actually evolved into the Sudanese Communist Party. So the Sudanese Communist Party historically was built on effort of labor unionization. And leaders of the Sudanese Communist Political Party has also been leaders of labor unions in Sudan. But I would say that since the 70s and the rise of neoliberal ideology, we've seen a lot of weakness in communist parties, generally speaking, in the left. And this appears in the way these parties is linked, or like leaders from those parties are linked to different NGOs, which is basically to a large extent would be a way of US or European imperialism. So that's weakened the struggle within itself. But I would say nothing is impossible. The sky is the limit. But at the same time, there is a sense of some sort of a competing Sudanese Communist Party with new rising forces from the left, or if you want to call it the more radical left. It's funny how ever since April 2019, the forces on the street has been to the left of the Sudanese Communist Party. And this is the first time that this ever happened in Sudan, which is a good sign, because like I said, it's a good sign for the Sudanese Communist Party, and it's also a good sign for Sudan in general.
Rabab, sorry to interrupt you. I wonder if we could take a few more questions at this point. Your answers have added considerably to the level of the discussion, and you've enlightened a lot of comrades here. But a couple of other people have indicated that they wanted to speak. So if we take them and they can come back in again later, is that okay with yourself?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so we have Steve Freeman, followed by Maddie Gray. I noticed that a few comrades still had their hands up, but they might have been just left there since the previous. That's Peter Sinclair, Steve Zeltzer. Now, if you want to speak a second time, of course, we may find time for that. But I'd ask comrades to be maybe a little bit briefer in their contributions. So we'll have Steve Freeman first, and then followed by Maddie.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Rabab, for all this. It's really made me think about something I knew little about, and thank you for Workers International putting this session on. Really brought something strongly to more to my attention and clarified that. What we've got here is, it seems to me from what you've described, as a struggle for democracy, and in fact a democratic revolution. The struggle for democracy that's been going a long time has become a democratic revolution. And it seems to me that there are lessons. We shouldn't just think this is something going on in Sudan. There are lessons. What we can learn from a democratic revolution in Sudan is also could be applicable here in this country. So there are maybe things from this process that we ought to think about. We can certainly see parallels between what's happening here and what's been happening recently in Chile. So in a democratic revolution, it's a contest, isn't it, between, it seems to me, between two forces, two contending poles, two contending powers. Somebody's mentioned an idea, almost two republics. So on one hand, you've got one republic, which is let's call it the Democratic and Social Republic, the Commonwealth of Sudan, with the slogan of freedom, peace and justice, with general assemblies, with neighborhood organizations. That's one democracy, one kind of republic. And against that is this other republic of the capitalists and the military are trying to sort something out. So although the bourgeois politicians and the military are now falling out amongst themselves, and the military have come back on the scene, these are two different processes going on. It's dual power. Somebody used the phrase dual power going on. So the question is, what does the Democratic and Social Republic, this People's Republic, if you like, what do they do? How do we advance that? And so it seems to me that you can go back to slogans like a provisional government. You need to transfer power from the present situation to a provisional government, and to have some sort of constituent assembly. Those are slogans and arguments that you could certainly have or use and be relevant. In other words, this People's Republic has got to get power. That's the essence of it. And so a comrade spoke about permanent revolution, but I think permanent revolution is not about substituting a socialist revolution for a democratic revolution. Rather, it is, how does the working class lead the democratic republic lead the democratic revolution to power. And only if it gets power is it possible then to spread that revolution internationally, because that's where socialism comes from. The spreading of that revolution internationally is what has to be, not to think of Sudan on its own, as it were, but part of a broader spectrum. So I think we as socialists have to think about what permanent revolution teaches us and what lessons that has that we can learn from Sudan and what we have to say about that. So I think we should think that the struggle for the People's Republic, as it were, is counterposed against this other republic of the military and the bourgeoisie, and which is backed by the imperialists, because the imperialists would like there to be some liberal regime, perhaps, that would keep the military under control, but the military not having that. So I think that's what we have to think about, the independence of this, I think, the republic that Rabab told us about, which is still alive. It hasn't been crushed. And that's where the answer lies. And I'll finish there.
Thank you, Steve. Our next speaker is Maddie, followed by Roger.
Rabab, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions going back to what I learned when I was following the history of Sudan a little more closely in the 1980s. But also a more recent question. I'll take the more recent one first. There was quite an upset a year or two ago about a dam that was being built in Ethiopia. Since then, Ethiopia has crumbled into internal war. And I've heard nothing more about the objections by Egypt and the Sudan to the building of this dam, which apparently is hydroelectric. And the fears in Sudan and Egypt were, of course, that the water for irrigation would disappear. And I think that I'd like to find out a little more about it. My older question relates to Islam. I was aware that there was, particularly in relation to what was going on in the fight with southern Sudan, that there was that Islam played a very important role. And there was a certain amount, as far as I could tell from the research that I was not personally working with, but I was editing and translating reports, that it appeared that Islam was being forced on people during the war. Now, what is the role today of Islam in the struggle of the working class, the people and women in Sudan? And the final part of my question, also in the 1980s, I interviewed a couple of women from Sudan, and that was about female circumcision, which they regarded in the 1980s as something that was really terrible and affecting the women of Sudan very negatively. I'd be very pleased if you can give us some kind of update on what the situation is today, because I should imagine that that can play a role in the mobilization of women and the ability of women to participate fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Roger.
A couple of questions. First of all, absolutely full gratitude to Comrade Rabab for her inspiring accounts of the situation. And I must say that I did not realize that the traditions of the Sudanese working class go back quite as long and as deep as you indicated. The fact that the trade unions have a history stretching back to 1908 was something which I was not aware of, and it explains a lot about the particular sort of consciousness that seems to be there in the Sudanese revolution. I was also very enthused by Rabab's emphatic insistence that the left had never been stronger in Sudan than it is at the present time. I think, again, it's inspirational, and it's also a vindication of something that we've always said in Workers' International Network, that the workers learn not just in days, but in minutes when they're involved in revolutionary uprisings in the way that they have so many times in Sudan, and particularly at the present time, that the traditions are there, and they learn from each struggle that they're involved in. And the interesting point is, first of all, Sudan has obviously played a big role, not only, well, within the whole region. The revolution in Sudan was more or less simultaneous with the uprising in Algeria in 2018. And also, of course, there's the whole history of the Arab Spring. And what I'd like to know is, well, two particular questions that I wanted to ask. First of all, to what extent has the struggle gone beyond simply democratic demands, and how much has it gone beyond the borders of Sudan? So first of all, I don't quite agree with Comrade Steve that it's a question of calling for a greater democracy, or certainly I don't like this phrase of a people's democracy. I think, on the contrary, it shows that we need a socialist democracy. But of course, socialism within the confines of Sudan would not be very viable. But what about the internationalism? What internationalism has been shown, if you like? How much of the Sudanese workers linked up with, say, the Algerian workers to develop a common struggle? How much? I know it's, of course, Egypt, the Egyptian working class is under the iron heel of the regime of Sisi, but nevertheless, there must be strong historic links between the Sudanese and the Egyptian working class. And how much is the struggle of the Sudanese revolution now? How much does it actually encompass a regional uprising and development of the revolution beyond the borders of Sudan? And also connected with that question is looking at the history of, or the recent history of the Sudanese movement. I was struck by the fact that at the beginning of the uprising, the soldiers fraternized with the workers. That there was, particularly, I think, when there was a brutal attack in 2019 by special forces, that I believe that soldiers fraternized with the workers and maybe came over to the side of the workers. And that's obviously a crucial issue. And now, since the recent coup, what is the attitude of the ordinary Sudanese soldier? How much is there any indication or evidence of any kind of resistance on the part of the Sudanese soldiers against the officer caste and against the generals, and in protection of the revolution? So all I'd say finally is just that the Workers' International Network really has always said that we need to learn from the struggles. We don't see ourselves simply as coming from our textbooks with advice to the working class and how they should proceed, but learning from the experience that the workers have come to in their democratic discussions in the course of the revolutions themselves. So we particularly welcome what Rabab has brought to us. And I hope that Rabab, I hope that you'll attend meetings of WIN, where we try to learn from the struggles that are taking place from every corner of the globe. So thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Roger. Steve Zeltser, you wanted to speak again?
Yeah, I was going to a couple of things. One, I was going to ask, what has been the role of the United States as far as the attack on Libya and funding of or support of these fundamentalist, right-wing fundamentalist groups in North Africa, the situation of the weaponization of Africa, and the role of these organizations in Sudan politically, and what do they represent in Sudan? And second of all, what has been the effect of COVID in Sudan, and what is the role of the multinationals, drug companies in Sudan as far as vaccines and protection of the Sudanese people?
Thank you, Steve. If I may, Rabab asked a question myself about South Sudan, and it got its independence, or declared its independence in 2011, becoming the world's newest state. But it's a failure as a state. And particularly when it did secede, a lot of the oil resources of the United Sudan went with the South Sudan secession. So my question is there any discussion or consideration of unity, of reuniting South Sudan with Sudan? Is it an issue at all? Does it raise its head in any way in the struggles? Certainly there's nothing being reported about that issue in the international media, but you may have some insights on that. So basically, is the South Sudan secession an issue in the in Sudanese politics? That's my question. Any other comrades who want to speak or ask a question? Okay, Rabab, there's nobody else, so you can take up the points that have been raised in the second series of questions.
Okay, thank you, Finn. So I want to start with the issue of South Sudan. I'm going to start with Finn's question. The issue of South Sudan, and if it's a failed state. The whole notion, I think, of a failed state is not necessarily put again with the people interest at hand, like the way you define whatever qualifies a state to be a failed state or not a failed state is not necessary for the best of interest of the people. So with that being said, I definitely would not want to critique or establish whether I think it's a failed state or not, because to begin with, I refuse the notion of a failed state. Because it's been the driving force of US imperialism. And who are you to define what is a failed state and what is the role of a state to begin with? But the discussion about unity, I think a lot of us are very helpful, and not just for South Sudan, but for the entire Horn of Africa. Especially during the first wave of the revolution, we've seen a lot of talks in the sitting about the unity of Horn of Africa as a whole. Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, South Sudan, and so on. But we in order for that to happen, you have to build, similar to the idea of how you unionize with freedom of association, you actually have to achieve like unity or peace is a result for the actual material on the ground. So assuming we're working towards freedom, peace, and justice, South Sudan or even other countries in the Horn of Africa would be just a matter of being united in a way that serves the people, but not in the way that we think of about borders and how borders are political and not necessarily with a social structure. Because socially, to a large extent, South Sudan is still part of like the Sudanese experience, and even within, we've seen a lot of, we even have martyrs since October 25th that their roots trace back to South Sudan, and they don't necessarily hold the official papers of Sudan. They hold papers from South Sudan, and in particular, I don't recall the name, but I very much remember that we have one martyrs like this. So I would say any talk about unity, whether if it's South Sudan or the entire Horn of Africa, is definitely within the reach and within the hopes of the Sudanese revolutionaries, but we don't see anything beyond result from freedom, peace, and justice. You actually have to allow the revolution to grow for whatever unity or peace to be real and to be based on material conditions rather than some way that political elite define that unity to be. Okay, I'll go back to how people can take power. And I think this is the struggle that we're facing right now. And like I said, there's a lot of mobilization, but we're still lacking into transforming this mobilization into a political act. There is a lot of talks among resistance committee about the political charter. And this is essential because it no longer allows some elite class to take over of the people's struggle. The people are actually taking the leadership into deciding how they want their country to be ruled. So there is a lot of talk in terms of that, and there's a lot of room for cooperation between resistance committee and different unions, but still at the early stages of talk. But I would say this needs to be translated, or like it will appear as a translation of a political will, a political movement. Someone also asked about the dam and the struggle between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. I don't feel qualified to answer that question. I wish if I had a good answer, but I don't, so I'm going to skip that part. And also someone asked about Islam and the separation/independence of South Sudan and what Islam plays as a role right now. And I would say this is very far from the 2018 revolution is very much a revolution based on a left wing agenda. Religion has been removed from the equation to a large extent, and to a point, and this has to do with how the Sudanese Communist Party got really a good standing on the street, especially in the early days of 2019, because usually being a communist is related with just you not being up for Islam or whatever. But like I would say that it's far away from the struggle, and it's always, I would even argue, it's always been not about Islam. Even the war in in South Sudan, it's always been about power, and it's always been about wealth. And I think as allies, we would like I would like you guys to comprehend that they're not like the ordinary Sudanese man is not a monster, is not a beast that is trying to force women or Islam into women or into other religious group. This is just a cover-up. It has always been a struggle about power. It's always been a struggle about wealth. And the fact that we asked the question about Islam and the role of Islam, I think to a large extent it helped dilute the struggle, which is not in the best interest of Sudanese people, because the Sudanese people are not really about, like, their struggle is not about what is defined as a good Muslim versus a bad Muslim. It's about how the Sudan is being ruled, who has power, and how is the wealth of Sudanese people is being distributed. And I would also refrain from answering the question about FGM, just because I would say that the way I feel about the question is, this is mainly an issue that people of Sudan and women of Sudan has to deal with internally. We have a history of the British actually issuing a law against FGM. And although this might be understood in the bigger picture as for the best interest of the Sudanese women, but you cannot liberate the people of Sudan without the participation of the people of Sudan. So this type of issue, this type of struggle, I prefer to keep it in the sense that Sudanese women and Sudanese actors are the stakeholder of this event, and not in the sense of some savior fixing the Sudanese people issues in FGM or in Islam or any other. It's about the experience of the Sudanese revolution and how it affects Egypt, for example, and the relationship between the working class in Sudan and the working class in Egypt. And funny enough is even during the last year or so, we've seen the slogan on the street being more radical, talking about new colonial and talking about the power of Egypt in Sudan. I would say that Sudan has always been the backyard of Egypt, but things are starting to change. Actually, on yesterday's Million March, somewhere in Europe, people actually marched to the Egyptian embassy and was met with Egyptians showing solidarity with the Sudanese movement. So I am very hopeful. There is a lot of interest and a lot of support and solidarity from Egyptian comrades. And I definitely agree that the liberation of the Sudanese working class will never actually be fully satisfied until the liberation of the Egyptian working class, and for that, say the entire region, just because how the nature of globalism work. I have a lot of hope for this, but as recent as yesterday, we've seen solidarity between Egyptians and Sudanese, and we've seen Sudanese talking directly to the point of Egyptians and AU and Saudi Arabia intervention in Sudan. Small rank soldiers, and if we've seen any support in terms of after the coup of the 25th. So to a large extent, even the military within the colonial structure that it has right now, a lot of the small rank soldiers have been kind of displaced from the military for whatever it took during 2019. And the forces that roam the streets of Sudan and is killing people right now are actually militias more than the army. The army is now one of the weakest link, whether it's a rapid support force, which I mentioned earlier, was very much put into power by the previous regime and the European Union, although the European Union continue to deny its ties to this, but we know and we have evidence documenting Khartoum process and how the rapid support forces was used to counter immigration from Africa to Europe. And definitely this has to do a lot with also the situation and militias in Libya, for example, generally speaking.
COVID.
There is one question, COVID. Yes, there was a question about COVID and vaccination and companies and how they affect it. So Sudan, the Ministry of Health, like almost all the other part of the Sudanese state, is very weak. We don't have numbers, or we don't have a count of like daily infection or infection rate, and we definitely don't have records on immunization. But I know that immunization is available in Sudan, but only as help from the WHO. Is not really, I'm not sure about direct companies. And the interesting part is we've seen how COVID kind of deterred the movement in Lebanon, for example. We did not see that in Sudan. And I think it has to do with the fact that the movement leading up to end of 2019 was strong enough and was mature enough to find ways of keeping the flame alive even during COVID. But I would say the situation of Sudan was not very different from the situation of the global South in terms of not having a say in how it manages the risk of the pandemic and how it can, because if talking about a complete lockdown or a shutdown in Sudan does not make sense, just because there is no infrastructure for that, and the nature of the working class itself in Sudan does not allow a shutdown. But to a large extent, the WHO and other agency that has to do with public health worldwide still fail to see the needs and the reality of the global South. So they still talk about health measures that are not designed for the global South. They're designed for the US, for example, or Europe, although we still don't see the US committing to it, but still it was never even put in the thought process, like You cannot give the same measures for Sudan and for the US and think that you're doing this for the best of the people in Sudan and the US. It doesn't make sense. I think these are the questions that I got so far. Finn, I'm not sure if I left something out accidentally.
No, I think you've covered the main points, definitely. I must say, in terms of your overall contribution, you've added enormously to the educational and, well, it was a very informative opening contribution, and your answering questions were also informative. And we all follow the media and the publicity around the revolutionary events and the strikes and movements in Sudan. But the insights you have provided, understandings you have given us is very, very helpful. And we're in contact to win. And also we wish well to Swartu and the movement that you're leading yourself amongst the trade unions. And we'd be interested to know what help we can give, because all of the comrades here are active in various ways in trade unions and socialist movements across the globe. So we should keep in touch and see what help concretely, and also in terms of politics, we can give to the struggles that are happening in Sudan. So thank you once again, Rabab, for your contributions to this meeting.